So hi, everyone, and welcome to Us and Flux Conversations. Us and Flux is a series of short stories and virtual gatherings like this one that explore how we might reimagine and reorganize our communities in the face of transformative change. We published our first story of this current 2022 season of Us and Flux in June, and we'll continue to publish one story per month and host one of these accompanying events through September. And you can read all the stories from this year and from our first season in 2020 when we published 11 stories at csi.asu.edu/usandflux. I'll share that link later in the event. The stories in this series all envision what we call civic experiments, considering the collectives, systems, and activities that could power the inclusive and thriving communities of our future. And our story for July models just that sort of thinking. It is titled University Speaking, and it is by Phoebe Wagner. It explores how we might redesign universities as radically open to their communities, better attuned to addressing local challenges and meeting local needs. And joining me today are two amazing special guests who I'm very delighted to have, and I will introduce you to the two of them. First is the story's author, Phoebe Wagner. Hi, Phoebe. Phoebe is an author, editor, and assistant professor of creative writing at Lycoming College in Pennsylvania. She's the editor of 3 solar punk anthologies, including Sunvault, Stories of Solar Punk and Eco-Speculation, which has been very formative in our work in that field here at the Center for Science and the Imagination. And in September, her new book, Almanac for the Anthropocene, a compendium of solar punk futures, will be published by West Virginia University Press. So congratulations on that, Phoebe, and thanks for being here with us. Also joining us is Punya Mishra, a professor, researcher, author, and designer at the Mary Lou Fulton Teachers College at Arizona State University, where he serves as Associate Dean of Scholarship and Innovation. So hi, Punya.
Thank you.
He co-chairs the Consultative Council of the Society for Information Technology in Teacher Education. And in addition to his teaching and research, he's also exhibited artwork at Michigan State University Museum. So got a couple of polymaths or Renaissance folks here today. And yeah, thank you both for being here and for taking the time.
Thank you. I prefer dilettante, but polymath will work as well.
Different connotations, but we're getting at the same thing. All right, so without any further ado, we're just going to launch in to talking a bit about this story and its implications. So Phoebe, can you help lay a foundation for this by starting us off, telling us a little bit about the story, maybe a capsule summary to refresh people's memories, and what inspired it?
Yeah, for sure. And just, thank you to you and Punya for doing this event. I'm so excited to see what our conversation is going to generate. And yeah, the story, University Speaking, really starts to question, what if we imagined a university or campus space to have agency or sentience? And in the story, the way I played that out was that it wanted to be united with the city that it was in. So that was sort of my generative point there. But ultimately, this unification comes about through the university sort of interacting with a gardener from the buildings and grounds crew. And this gardener is just as much a part of the university as she is a part of the city that she comes from. And that sort of creates the bridge to start breaking down barriers between the university and the rest of the city. And the way that that sort of starts is actually with a community garden on an unused sort of lawn at the university. But then this, of course, grows into other projects that are more focused on community resilience until ultimately the campus and the city come together and the campus is no longer isolated from the sort of larger city community. So that was kind of the idea that I was playing around with in this story. And it was very much inspired by all the campuses that I've been on. I've been in higher education as a student for many years now, and then also as a professor, and just seeing how campuses have been spaces for community engagement, or they've been sort of cordoned off from the community and what that means. And then as we see climate change and then events like COVID-19 impacting our campuses, we're going to really have to start thinking about what is the purpose of a campus, particularly if it's right downtown or if it's right in the middle of a city. So part of the story was thinking about that, and was also inspired by my own experience with environmental issues. In 2011, there was severe flooding in the area I was living in at the time, and it wasn't my university, but a university close to where I was a student basically closed down for quite a while because the flooding had been so bad on their campus. And so I really wanted to start thinking about how can we engage our campuses
gonna say we lost you for just like
Oh,
2
no.
seconds there. Can you, it was like seriously just the end of your thought. So do you remember what you were,
Yeah,
wrapping up with?
I was just thinking about as our campuses are impacted with climate change, how are we going to address that? How are we going to connect to that? Because they are already experiencing these impacts. This isn't something that's coming, it's something that's impacting our campuses right now.
Yeah. What strikes me, tracking back to something that you said a moment ago, is about the embeddedness of universities with their communities. And I think one thing the story did for me was it made me think about all of the statements that institutions make about being responsive to their communities, embedded with their communities, in service of their communities. And it's like, what if that was taken seriously? And I'm not saying that it isn't in many institutions in many places, but it's like this story models a sort of thoroughgoing seriousness about the responsibilities of universities to the communities that they're situated in. And I thought that was really, I don't know, appropriate to a moment when universities are being asked to do different things, and we're all kind of reevaluating, as you said, what they're for and where they sit in our society. So to build on that and to take us in a direction, university speaking is at first blush, and as I was just talking about human institutions. It's also about architecture and infrastructure. I mean, it's about sort of, in some ways, enlivening and subjectifying a collection of buildings and sort of terraformed and landscape spaces and giving them a voice. And but it's also, as you continue to say, attuned to broader environmental forces and ecosystems and pressures on the natural world. So like, how does the story get us thinking about these, not just universities maybe, but also just institutions in general in new ways, and perhaps reimagining how they work and thrive through that kind of encounter with the environment, with ecosystems, with non-human beings?
Yeah, part of what I've been thinking about just generally and sort of came through in this story was, climate change is going to have an intensely local impact in addition to obviously the global issues that we're seeing now. But we're going to have this intense local impact. And oftentimes we speak about, the towns and what the cities go through. But then when we have these campuses that are right in the center of these cities, like these places are going to be heavily impacted too, and also have the option to be incredibly useful, I think, in these moments of crisis or preparing for these moments of crisis. So that's been something I've been thinking about as I'm, assistant professor at my own college. Like, how can I think about this and engage in this on my own campus? But certainly higher education is not going to end with climate change, right? It's going to change, it's going to be adapted, but how is this going to adapt with the changes that are coming, particularly as a place or a location? And I think it's pretty easy for us as environmentalists or environmental writers to think of place as being alive, like, the woods or mountains or things like that as being alive. But I've been starting to think about man-made or human-made places as also like as their own ecosystem or biomes. Like, how does that change how we interact with these places if we start thinking of them as alive? So one line that really sort of started to shift how I was thinking was actually from Jeff Vandermeer's Southern Reach trilogy, where he starts to write about a building that's come alive at the end of the trilogy. And he writes that it had built its own ecosystem, its own biosphere. And that was one of those lines I came across in literature that just kind of like shifted how I saw the world a little bit. And so I've been trying to address that and figure out, what does that look like? What does it look like if we see a university for it being a man or human-made space as being alive? And how does that reimagine our response to climate change locally in particular?
So if I can jump in here, Joey, I think the piece that struck me in the story, Phoebe, that you wrote was the sort of a first person plural account of the university speaking, which is the title of the story itself, right? And what was and the manner in which you sort of the layers in which you talk about sort of ecosystems, whether it's the garden and then the university and then the broader community and the world outside of it impacting and vice versa, makes like really brings that sort of agency of the organization, forefront in a very powerful sort of lyrical kind of a way. And as I was thinking about this, I was just, went back to what the word university means, and it comes from the Latin for universus, which means the whole. But there are two ways of seeing it. So one is to create this little closed up hole where we as scholars and researchers and academics sit and think deep thoughts, and there is a value to that, to be cut off from the rest of the world. But I think that you are pushing, let's say, idea of university also pushes in a different direction, which is outward. And I think what the story does really well is speak to that outward movement as emergent from the idea of the university. So it's the idea of the university coming to fruition of this being a part of the human interaction and the world around us, which I thought was like really powerful and just a nice, like you said, it's a lovely sort of a on the idea, but I think it lets it emerge in a very powerful way.
Yeah, and once we start to see this, I think the university as an entangled experience, right, as a larger part of this community, I think it just opens up different possibilities for what education can look like and what higher education can look like, in addition to what community looks like for our students and for administration and professors and things like that. So I think it adds opportunity. It doesn't detract ultimately.
Right. And, if you think about how we often talk about academia, and it's the ivory tower and, and so on. And I think what this story really does is nudge us to think of a different model altogether. And I love the use of language of, very of gardening and ecology and ecosystems, because I think that's where resilience comes in. And I think one of the sort of underlying themes that emerges from this is it's only this way, that these organizations can be resilient to the challenges that will be definitely, we have already facing and will increase face in the future.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think there's a kind of a contrast or juxtaposition built into the story between like the idea of a university as a sheltered or sort of closed space, a sanctuary maybe, right? That model of like the ivory tower or whatever. And then on the other hand, the open university that is I'm just going to say open again, but open to folks who aren't like part of the staff or the student body, but also doesn't have walls, but like literally between it and the city and the sort of the geography around it, that and the story kind of questions, and you see that there's this provost character who represents one perspective, but questions like what's going to be better for the long-term health and success of the institution, to be closed and focused and to serve an insular community, or to be kind of open and welcoming and kind of thus open to change and revision and a complication of the mission, perhaps.
Well, I think particularly in reference to climate change, because something I've been wrestling with in my own research is that climate change is not going to be borderless, right? There will be no border to what the impacts that climate change has. And I think that's going to be very difficult for institutions that in some ways rely on borders, that do have that border insularness built right into them, to adapt to this way of thinking. And that's something that I wanted to really play with, is if I can imagine a higher educational system that can get rid of that border and also can get rid of like hierarchy and other sort of things that are solidified in higher ed, what does that look like? How does that start to shift how we think about learning and what education means and the value of that education?
So Punya brought up style, and the story, for those who haven't read it or who read it a little while ago, this is a first person plural narration. We using that pronoun a lot, and it's quite lyrical in its prose style and its diction. Phoebe, how did you get to that style, and why? I don't know. I'm asking you to account for it a little bit. Like, I guess I'd ask, like, what possibilities does that style open up? Like, what are the affordances of it in kind of unfolding the story the way you wanted to?
Yeah, this is a style that I've been developing over a couple of different pieces for a while now, mainly in response to trying to push back against individualism in writing. In the US, so much of our storytelling is based around the individual, whether it's the hero's quest or even just, the basic writing advice that I teach my students. You have a character that has a need and an obstacle, and they're trying to overcome that, right? And so I've been trying to figure out, how do we undermine this? How do we undermine this individualistic tendency, which is so very much built into US values and is harmful to many of us? And so I've really hit upon the way that I found the most useful sort of tool for that has been point of view, and using this first person plural, using this we voice, this sort of communal voice for that. And it just seems like it's the best way to start undermining the individualism, and it opens up different possibilities, because when you're looking at a community struggle versus an individual struggle, scale, response, possibility, and also how we think about endings and how we think about what is possible in a story start to shift and change. So that's something that I've been developing for a bit to try and push back against that, particularly as like someone who does a lot with solar punk writing. And in terms of the lyricism, for whatever reason, when I'm in this first person plural, there are oftentimes I do find myself coming back to this lyrical sound. And it's just something that I've been enjoying playing with. And I really enjoy it. I can't really speak artistically other than the fact that it's fun for me to write. And it seems to work with the voice that's sort of I've been developing over the course of a couple stories at this point. So that's kind of where it comes from. But for me, it's just trying to capture a communal feeling rather and push back against individualism.
So
Punya,
if I can,
yeah, I was going to
sorry,
ask,
Joe, just want to build on
Yeah.
it. I reread the story again this morning, and honestly, the style that you have there, it almost had me in tears, because it had this thing of this vision of what an university can be, which is all of us are part of that, and how far we fall from that aspiration. And the way that I think the lyrical style really bring that vision to the forefront. But the other point, as I will speak now, which I thought was really interesting with the plural sort of, is that there is not given take an ecological stance and universities fitting within this broader ecology, then there is not going to be one university. And I think that having that plurality in there means that there are many different futures university could have, which, because it struck me, I think it's early on in the story where, the first time you hear that plural voice and you say, what does that mean? And it means, to me, it meant that there are many potentialities within that. And what will emerge will be a function of history and circumstance and design and lack thereof and all of the above. Because I could imagine one version of the story where the tree doesn't fall and break the wall, and something else happens to open the university of, which would end up becoming a different, but a possible positive future. So I loved that. So I think that the first person plural allows your mind to explore alternatives, because there are many embedded possibly within there. Does that make sense?
Oh yeah, that makes total sense. And that is exactly what I hoped would occur, and what I hope when I write this type of story, especially, like, I want people to do, because, where I'm based in central Pennsylvania, the needs are going to be so different than where you all are based out in Arizona. So there's a variety of needs that are going to have to be met, and each place is going to have to be different in how it approaches it. And there's not going to be one single fix for climate change, for any social injustice issue. That's why there needs to be this focus back on, like, the local community and what does the local community need. So yeah, I'm so glad that came through, because that's something that is very important when I'm trying to write these stories.
Yeah, I mean, we think about, Bangladesh, right? I mean, What does a university mean in that situation? I mean, there are so many ramifications of that. So I love that rhetorical move there that you did, which allowed that to sort of fester in my head.
Wonderful. I'm so glad.
Cool.
So this move that we've been talking about dovetails with something that's happening in speculative fiction, I think. We talked a bit previously, the three of us, about Richard Powers' novel, The Overstory, but also in, like, environmental law and environmental advocacy, which is saying, like, what happens when we start to see natural systems and non-human systems as alive, as having integrity, as having intelligence, as having some sort of form of agency. This goes back decades to, like, actor network theory and some of its implications, for sure. But the story is, like, doing, makes accessible and immediate, I think, that idea that, like, the university or the surrounding city, the other kind of non-human entity that acts in the story, might be said to have agency. And what that makes me think of, in light of our conversation, is the way that, like, the pledges that institutions like universities make there, and the culture that we see. We still will say, we go to a different campus, so it has a different vibe. The culture is different here. It's like that's saying that there's a form of collective agency that only exists as a kind of accretion of a bunch of individual people making decisions, making pledges, following through, not following through. feeling cognitive dissonance about maybe not acting totally in line with that pledge, or changing the way they behave in light of it. So I wonder what both of you think, as people who work in and sort of owe a lot to universities as a locus of experience. Like, what do we gain by thinking of universities as having agency, as these, like, as you were saying, these complicated bodies that are sort of made up of, like, thousands, many different multivariate factors, people and non-human agents acting in different directions? Like, why is that a helpful way to think, as opposed to thinking of the university as, like, I don't know, like, an arm of the state, or just like its donors,
an economic
or its
organization,
students.
or
An economic organization. There you go.
Phoebe, do you want to go first?
Do you want to go first?
No, it's fine. Go ahead.
I can tell
All
it's
right.
kind of a rough question because you two are arguing about who has to go
No,
first.
it's more that ultimately, I don't know if I have a response, but before I get to the ultimately, I'm going to back up and say one of the things that I think is important when thinking about this, which is perhaps maybe a little of a angled away from how you were talking about it, Joey, is that the university as a constructed human-made space is also part of some of the rethinking I've been doing about how some spaces are alive, but also how they've been used for that agency, or that sense of aliveness has also been, like, bad, right? Like, like the educational system has a long history of, settler colonialism, of, negative impacts on environmental spaces, on still the use of prison labor on spaces, the enshrinement of white supremacists. Like, there's a lot of things I think that our universities are still, like, sort of absorbed with, and I think in the story, I did a very sort of utopian vision. Like, this was a very university that wanted good things, but I think right now we're in this moment where in order to get to these ideals and live up to these ideals that are enshrined in a lot of universities, sort of ideologies, that are not maybe necessarily always happening, I think it's important to start thinking about these as powerful places. These are powerful places. And if we can start to engage with that notion, then I think it's a little bit easier to start looking at the harm that's been done and the good things that have been done, and be like, okay, how do we start mitigating this harm and making a more equitable and just community, and that we can keep working in that direction. And so I think that's kind of, I know that's a little sideways from how you asked the question, but I think that's one way that I think giving human-made, I would keep wanting to say man-made, implying the gender of it, but these human-made spaces, right? These human-made spaces can have, like, negative impacts as well, and thinking about that. But then ultimately, to the end of your question, though, I'm not really sure, like, what entirely we do get from thinking about this. This is something I'm wrestling with in my creative writing right now, and trying to figure out what do we get from thinking about these places as alive, as having their own biosphere, as Jeff Vandermeer put it. And I think it's good things ultimately, but I'm not quite sure, like, what comes out of this, other than it's changing how I look at the world, which I think it's always good when we have these kind of shifts in our thinking, and seeing the world as more alive and in every way, I think is a great tool in helping us adapt to climate change. So I don't really have a very good answer, but I think it's important just to, whenever you come across those types of shifts in thinking, to embrace that and see what comes of it.
Yeah, I just, before Punya jumps in, hopefully, I love what you said about, recognizing the power of these institutions, because they do, if for anyone who's, like, lived in, like, a college town, certainly it's like, that's the economic driver sometimes of that town. It's sometimes the largest employer. A lot of the cultural events in that town take place on that campus. Like, seasonal changes and the migration of students changes the whole character of the place. Like you said, huge environmental effects. Sometimes the town's a major landowner and leases. And so the university is making decisions that shape the character of the town and how it develops over time. So I think that grappling with that is really important, because I think people sometimes default into thinking of universities as just, like, slightly bigger schools, and, like, they actually have just much more transformative effects on the spaces around them. Not that schools don't, but yeah. Punya, love to invite you to jump in.
Yeah. So I think, the first response to whenever somebody asks me, about treating an organization as having agency, I keep going back to Mitt Romney's sort of quote, which he got pilloried for, like, organizations are people too, and rightfully so. But funnily enough, very recently I had a conversation with Ravi, who is a professor of management, who we were talking about all kinds of other things, but this sort of came up. And the thing that he said, which I think was very insightful, which is that the way Mitt Romney or that idea comes from is seeing an organization as a legal entity having X, Y, and Z relationship with things outside of it, right? But I think what you are doing in the story is flipping that on its head and saying that there is this emergent phenomena that occurs once we put a group of people together around some kind of a broader vision. I mean, let's look at ASU's charter. We are known for who we include rather than who we exclude. That's the first thing we say. And that becomes, in some ways, how we try to lead our lives, professionally speaking, right? And in some way, I think this idea of giving agency to these larger super organisms, so to speak, makes sense, not just rhetorically, because I think, the example I always give is that you can understand automobile engine inside out. You will never understand a traffic jam. Understanding a traffic jam requires understanding a whole socio-political, techno-historical sort of legacy of X, Y, and Z, right? And so I think what it gives us a frame of reference of thinking about these organizations as actually having an impact. Like you said, historically very negative, but here you are offering a vision which is a more organic, logical, connected vision that's a possibility as well. So I think there is a great value to that. And the reason I started with the Mitt Romney story is because that's the mutual reaction whenever people give sort of agency to a group, and I'm like, I don't know, it's just made up of people. But I think it's the relationships between the people that determine the culture of the place and its impact inside and outside as well, right? So just a couple of thoughts there. Yeah.
No, I love that. And I think ultimately too, it comes back to community, right? And I think that having that healthy community culture is going to change the impact of that place. And so thinking about, community, I think gets connected to agency in an interesting way through some of what you were saying. So yeah, I think that's very, very cool.
So one of the things that I think a lot about is this idea of culture, right? Like, what is a culture? And I think the best definition I've come up with is the stories that we tell. Right? The stories that we tell of ourselves, of the organization that we are a part, and why we are here, and so on. And I think that what this story does, it offers an alternative story to the organizations or people too, and then they can give money to political campaigns. You know what I mean? And so that I think is very powerful. And I think there is a move, Richard Powers being a good example of starting to think of ecosystems and so on, which is why I think the gardening and your use of language becomes so powerful in that.
So I want to actually get into something that I feel like is almost like a lacuna in the way I've structured this conversation, which is universities as places where education happens, where learning happens, places that administer courses and offer degrees and things like that. So, amidst all of this appreciation of universities and all of their complexity, learning and formal education continues to be a central role for the university. And that's true in the story as well, even as the educational paradigm changes. And we'll talk more about that, I'm sure. That is still a kind of key thing that the university is doing in this story and in our world, right? So, we're in a place in the midst of this pandemic where education has changed a lot. We have a sort of a vantage point to talk a lot about transformation and where it happens and where it stalls and things like that. But how does the story, I guess, imagine the future of learning, or help us imagine the future of learning? And how does it either, extend or cut against or complicate trends that we've seen during the pandemic, for example, towards digital and distance learning and learning management systems that are online and things like that? So how does the story kind of articulate with some of the changes we've seen recently? And then what is the kind of the vision that the story is sort of pointing us towards?
Yeah. And that was obviously one of the reasons why I wanted to approach higher education is, I've been in it not as long as y'all have, but I've been in it for a while now. And I wanted to see how can we start imagining things differently? And I think in general, we're seeing a pretty strong trend of higher ed moving towards more community-based learning, or learning that embraces the community. And that's really exciting. But there still remains oftentimes is associated with a degree, right? So knowledge that gets associated with a degree. And part of what I tried to imagine, particularly in the second half of the story, is how can we have both, right? How can we have community-based learning, and then how can we have a knowledge system that is not necessarily defined by the hierarchy posed by having the doctorate or the master's degree or something like that. And so like the way I kind of phrased it in the story was, how can we have professors and students in like a mutual aid center and a clinic, and have that value be equal? And then conversely, how can we value the education from community members and make that just as important as the education received from a professor? How can we sort of start to equalize this? And that was breaking down those hierarchies, and sort of that utopian vision that I was sort of writing about was very much how I was trying to inspire it, because hierarchies, of course, their own type of border when we start thinking about it in that way. And I think the transition will be easier for higher education to support local communities through climate change and like sort of all these entangled social justice issues, if we can start to undermine that hierarchy, still value education, but not necessarily focus it in on a hierarchical sort of institution. And sort of to get to your second half of your question about sort of online learning through the pandemic, that was something I really wrestled with when I was trying to write this story, because it didn't quite fit, and I couldn't figure out why it wasn't fitting. Throughout the pandemic, for about 2 years, I taught via Zoom. So I was very much familiar with that and how it was being used as a tool. And I think for me, it was in some ways a failure of imagination on my part. My experience with teaching via Zoom was very much that was a Band-Aid for a situation that needed to be reimagined. Rather than being the reimagined fix, it really just kind of glued everything together and was like, all right, here, we're still in a classroom, it's just virtual. And there needed to be a different, I think, a bigger, like sort of broader systemic change that we just didn't materialize for me while I was teaching Zoom. So that's kind of was my struggle with it. I wasn't quite sure how to do it. I think it's still very valuable, but it's just there's more transformative possibility there, but I couldn't quite get it. But maybe Punya will have a better idea on that.
Oh, I don't know if I have a better idea, but I think that partly, I mean, we have to be, I think, kind to ourselves, because, you know, schools and everything's shut down. I mean, the UNESCO data is like 2 billion learners out of school in 2 months, 6 months, 6 weeks, or something like that, right? So we were dealing with a global pandemic, and we tried to do the best that we could. And I think educators have to be commended for the efforts that they took to stay connected. There are 2 strands here that I would like to sort of pick on, right? So I worry that will become the model of what we think online learning or learning can be, right? Which is that it's going to be sitting in these Zoom classes and so on. And if we look at the variety of human experience and things that we are doing using these tools and technologies, where you see incredible creativity from, you know, young youth. I mean, I'm having some conversations with people in India about things that they're seeing young kids do with these technologies today, right? And so there's a rich array of experiences there that for some reason we have channeled into this little box and said, this is what learning can and should be. There is a deeper systemic issue here, because we've, again, I think going back to your original point of the story, seen higher ed as being this closed box, right? And there are certain things built in which we haven't yet questioned, but I think your story starts to question. If there is one university in higher ed, it's the Carnegie unit. And there is a, you know, and if you think about what it actually means, it means we measure learning by the amount of time you spent on the task, which we know some people learn faster. There are certain things I learned faster than others, or topics that might be different, but we have said this is our currency. That gives us portability across institutions. So you can get an undergraduate here and transfer there, so on and so forth. Go from community college to 4-year. However, it also constrains us in certain ways, because it says, oh, if we had 3 hours of time, now we need to do 3 hours of Zoom. You know, and so I think that we have to start. So I'm saying that it's not just the hierarchies we have to question, because those are walls too, but I think that there are these systemic structures, which are the skeleton on which this whole enterprise is built, that I think we need to question as well. You know, and I think there are some pushes in that direction already with micro-credentials and blockchain or what have you. I don't know what's going to emerge, but I think that's a really important conversation to have, because even economically, to have that you leave everything for 4 years and you do X, how viable or useful is that? You know, as a, and what does that mean? And, so anyway, so lots of questions here, but I think that it is really, to me, of imagination about what is possible, and a lack sometimes of questioning certain foundational things which have become transparent to us because that's just the air we breathe, and I think this is where I think fiction comes in. This is where imagination comes in, is asking those questions which otherwise people wouldn't ask. The provost, for instance, wouldn't ask in your story.
And that's something that I was just going to go back to what you said earlier, that culture is the stories that we tell, right? And I think, as we know, we got plenty of creative writers and other storytellers, regardless of their, what their specialization is in higher ed. And so I hope we keep having these imaginative moments where we reimagine what education could look like. I was very much inspired to write about higher ed because I read Ursula K. Le Guin's The Dispossessed, which reimagines education through an anarchist ideology. And so I hope that we, like you said, continue to have those imaginative moments and stories to help us envision what the possibilities are.
Yeah, I think, and thank you, Punya, I want to say for bringing up that Carnegie unit, because that, amidst all of the recent discussion, some of it constructive and some not so constructive, about testing and grading and, digital access to Zoom classrooms and things like that, I think, what we forget or don't see is that those substructures, that the credit hour, and these methods for making learning, like you said, portable and, creditable across institutions, across time, across different subjects and fields. Like, I'm sure that's not the only one, but, there are these institutional sort of substructures that are harder to re-narrate and that don't work their way into science fiction that much. Maybe Le Guin aside, as usual, she's probably the exception that proves the rule. But yeah, I think the story, a piece of flash fiction, of course, begins to kind of point us in some directions to say, like, well, what if we started taking these collective and ecological metaphors as a way to rethink? And that's where I think it's really valuable. This is sort of, again, like me, pushing just into one fragment or corner of the story. I guess one of the things that happens in the story is that the climate crisis, as effects are felt locally, and perhaps like local effects intensify, the university literally has to start like delivering courses differently, restructuring its academic year, but also like certain departments seem to become more important. So like environmental studies becomes more important. There's more like mutual aid type education. There's more community sort of like maker DIY stuff. I think the brewer in the town starts teaching courses about fermentation and things like that. So it makes me think, like, how do universities need to respond, not just to like COVID specifically and, distance and social isolation has to happen there, but like also to the climate crisis and to environmental degradation, and like what new roles will institutions of higher education need to take on, like when they start grappling more, as we start to grapple more seriously with the climate crisis?
Yeah, and that's something I've been thinking about so much, like I said, as I'm making my own home and making my own space on the campus that I now work on. And I think for me, once again, it comes back to sort of starting to break down that hierarchy of education, right? Because there's so much space, and this is certainly definitely happening. There's so much space for, like, that specialized environmental science professor and the person who really the fisherman that really knows the waterways, or the person that loves to fish and hunt and knows this forest, to come together and to be able to think about how we can adapt to climate change. And I think sometimes there's just these barriers that come up that between those relationships happening. And certainly those relationships do happen. That's not to say this, but something that I was thinking about was, how can we value, the bartender who becomes the brewer as much as we value a university president? And once we can like get that value to be equalized, once there's like, equality there, I think that's going to help make our communities more adaptable to climate change, because we won't be focusing on rarefied knowledge, we'll be sharing it, right? And there's just so much knowledge in the community that can then, when combined with these specializations, could just be so useful to adaptation and to keeping the community healthy and just thriving when change comes. And I think too, education has, right now we're kind of in that moment with student loans. We're trying to think, what is the value of education? And Punya, you brought up the great point about going somewhere for 4 years, and particularly, as climate change continues to impact different areas, and then there's social justice issues that are, of course, entangled with that. Will it be viable for a student that's, a California wildfire has impacted their family and they're over on the East Coast? Like, what is the viability of that? And how can we make sure that that student can be, in their home community as well as their educational community? So those are just some things that I was thinking about, and thinking about how to adapt. But then just thinking about, education cannot really continue to be this sort of pull yourself up by your bootstrap class shifting either. We need to think of it as a tool that can help, better people. And certainly that's how a lot of, I think, professors and teachers, and of course, administration and staff think about education. But we're also seeing it become more sort of turned to business in a way that I think is disturbing to many of us. And so just as we think about education less as a capitalist business practice and more work to equalize the college with the community at large, I hope that education can really become and be approached as a tool to help communities thrive through sharing knowledge rather than systems that cause extreme debt or separate people from their home community when they really need to be there. So those are just some things that I've been thinking about when it comes to this idea of like civic experiments, and some things I tried to capture in the story.
So speaking as somebody who was an international student, right? So I think that, so your words resonate even more powerfully when I think about people who have shifted across continents in order to go to school, and, and so on. And so if I think about a student from, I keep using the example of Bangladesh, but I could say India, during the COVID crisis, they couldn't go home. They were stuck here, or if they went there, come back. And we're going to see more and more of those. And organizers need to start becoming sensitive to those special needs, because those are very unique needs, And so I think this is where I think the story towards the back end, sort of the middle and back end, where, you start getting these glimpses of climate change and its impact, you start realizing that the global and the local become intertwined in very complicated ways, because solutions that have to emerge or will emerge will be intensely local, but will be by forces that are incredibly global, and you can only see how different communities and countries responded to COVID-19. I mean, people look at New Zealand as having done an amazing job, but hey, they are a little island. They could choose to do what they did, while China trying to lock down all the time. It's clearly facing a very different challenge. And so, and this is a global pandemic responses. I mean, so I think that to me is part of why sort of the organic aspect that you bring to the ecological aspect that you bring in becomes really powerful, because ecologies by their very nature are connected to the here and now, even though they are being influenced by forces which are bigger and wider and so on.
Yeah, there's something about the adaptability that the institution in the story models that is inspiring, because I think again, with the pandemic, we got to see lots of different types of responses in different places, but, it demonstrated how hard it is to change tracks for educational institutions that have to serve a lot of stakeholders, from their students to the parents to their own faculty and staff to like legislators and policymakers in their state and donors. And, I think like that, that kind of organic adaptability as a kind of, I don't know, a model maybe for how we might think about remaking universities is inspiring. It sort of encourages all of us as readers to say like, okay, what would that actually look like for my university, for my department, for my community? And it's hard to do this stuff at scale, but I do think the story has got me thinking in a much more productive way about like, well, what if we just change the way that we talk about this? And perhaps that would start to inspire new kinds of structures that aren't so top down or rigid. Because I see all the time in universities, and been in and around universities for most of my adult life, like, something as simple as like, again, credit hours, transferring things between departments, faculty getting promotions, moving money around between different kinds of accounts. It's like this stuff's really hard, and it takes a huge amount of labor to do, but it's like thinking of structures that don't require that hierarchy and that pyramid or that kind of flow chart. Maybe there's some different metaphors we can start using and thinking about organizing ourselves at scale.
Well, and I think too, just to jump on that really quickly, to even think about the institution as adaptable, I think is important, because I think there's a sense that this is how it's done. This is what higher ed means. And I think that's something that like I've had to like think about too with my own thinking, is like what ways have I stratified myself that I don't need to be doing that, I can just break things apart and think about adaptability, or fluidity, and what things are we attached to that we have no reason to actually be attached to, that there's no reason for change, or there is reason for change and we're just holding on to something. So yeah, that's something too that I hope is inspiring. It's just we can adapt. We don't have to do this the same way. It's kind of like going back to the credit hours comment.
Right. So I mean, one of the things that it becomes sort of my mantra these days is the fact that all of this stuff made up. The idea that you will sit in a metal box and will be driven to the space where you're going to spend from 7:30 to 2:30, 50-minute periods learning math. And then, this stuff, we just made it out of whole cloth. And, partly historical contingent, but, again, not saying ill intention on anybody's part and so on. But unless and until we recognize the fact that this stuff is made up, there is no way we can go and change it. So if I can put a plug for the work that we're doing in our college right now around the Learning Futures work, we are bringing teams of interdisciplinary teams of people together to ask questions like this, right? What if, and how can we? So whether it's refugee education or thinking about bias in AI systems, or it is about sustainability or so on, I think we can ask some very foundational questions if and only if we recognize the fact, that this is made up, and which means we can change it, right? I think that's the beauty of it.
So, okay. I want to kind of like wrap us up, I think, with another big question before we say farewell. So and it's really just more like putting a sharper point on a lot of things that we've been talking about, perhaps, and bringing it back to the Us and Flux series. So, for 2022, we were kind of like, we started the series as the pandemic hit North America, and now we're 2 years into it, and like a lot of things are different, and a lot of things feel like they've been reorganized, and a lot of things feel sort of the same in a kind of haunting way. But what we wanted to try to do this time around with these stories and conversations was think about reconfiguration and reinvention, rethinking institutions, systems of governments, cultural norms, and community structures, to say like, how do we actually like take a local context, specific human and physical geographies, and like imagine interventions that would change them in some sort of positive way, and make communities and spaces more just and equitable and sort of culturally vibrant. So like, how does this story serve as a tool for getting us thinking about like reimagining universities in that way, or reimagining higher education in that way? What would it mean for universities to be radically open in this way? And I guess for each of you, like, how does this story work as a kind of like civic experiment with this particular institution? What are some of its like kind of implications?
Yeah, I think for me, and like sort of the challenge I've set up for myself, stepping back as the professor at not speaking to me.
We lost you for another moment there, Phoebe. Can you just repeat the last sentence or you said, I think, and we'll be good.
No, I just started, so this is fine. So I think for me, what I did was I set myself up with my own challenge in the story, stepping back as the professor rather than just the writer, and starting to think about, where is the university speaking to me, to use the title of the story? Like, where can I, with my skill set, use these skills to think about adaptability, to think about fluidity, to think about community and how I can be out in the community and break down, sort of work to break down this divide or these barriers. And so I hope that, that people also feel inspired to think about what their position is in this adaptability, and to think about what they can give to their community. There's, we, as folks that work in higher ed, there's so much giving that happens in the community on campus, and that sometimes I think it's hard to like muster the energy to be like, okay, now I'm going to turn to the community outside of the campus, but figuring out how to make that happen is sort of, I think, what I have set up, the challenge I have set up for myself, that I'm have been trying to think about and meet in the past year, and so I hope that's inspiring to other people too. What needs, where's the university speaking to you? What needs can you make, and how can you remember that this is all made up, and that we can change, we can adapt, we can do things differently to meet community needs and our student needs and our city and our city's needs, all those different things. So that's what I hope comes out of this.
So, reading the story, because it has got such a utopian ending to it, despite the fact that the world is going to whatever in a handbasket. And then comparing it to the reality that we have is actually quite heartbreaking sometimes, at some point. But I think what the story does give us, it gives us a new metaphor. And I think that that's really powerful of thinking about an university in a different way. And it gives us new language. And I think what that allows us to do is see possibilities which otherwise you would not have seen otherwise. So to me, if anything, this is sort of, I can see this used in a graduate class or and not just a graduate class, but in a classroom, say, okay, let's read the story. What impact does this have? What does it mean? What does it change in your relationship to? Because, if you think about in this story, the university is seen as this, this organism, so to speak. But even within that, there are smaller ones, just like we are made up of organs and cells, there are classrooms and courses and workshops. And, what implications does that have for each of those pieces as well? Because that's what makes the whole. I think it allows us to have that conversation, at least a new direction. And I think that to me is, it's food for thought, so to speak.
Great. Because we have a moment, I want to selfishly spring a question on both of you, which is, what is a piece of science fiction or a piece of speculative fiction or whatever other types of literature that has inspired you in thinking about education and thinking about or in thinking about learning more broadly? Is there something that sticks out?
Oh, I can go. So I already mentioned The Dispossessed by Ursula K. Le Guin, and that's definitely one that's just, when I read it and read her conceptualization of higher education, I was definitely blown away. And it was just very interesting to me. Particularly the moment I liked is students request what they would like to learn about in connection with a person who is a specialist in that area. And I thought that connection, which certainly other thinkers and theorists have come up with before, but seeing that modeled in a piece of fiction was really cool. But I'm going to throw a second one out because I already mentioned The Dispossessed, and N.K. Jemison's Broken Earth trilogy was really interesting. It doesn't really give a model of education per se, but it talks about how knowledge and systems of knowledge can be used to dominate groups of people. And then more importantly, it shows how to break that system of knowledge. And it's used through this idea of stone lore, so ideas written in stone, which was really fascinating. But then of course, they've been erased, they've been rewritten, even though they're in stone, right? So it's just a really interesting, that sort of metaphor that she sets up through her world building can really be exploded out into how we think about knowledge in our world off the page. So those are two that have been inspiring to me.
So I have to share this one very briefly, which I think, Joey, you know about. Mm-hmm. A story by Ursula Le Guin that she never wrote. Because I read it back when I was in high school and my undergrad, and I created this whole story in my head till finally I tracked it down. It's by Orson Scott Card. It is almost completely different from what I remember it. And I've written a long post on my website, so those who are interested should go read it. But it revealed to me, you can do research on memory and how we make stuff up. For it to be so starkly put in front of you was amazing. So I still think that the story that I imagined, Le Guin having written, was in some ways sort of captures my about how human potential and talent can play out depending on the context, and I think that's a really powerful thing, because I often wonder about Ramanujan, who was discovered just by chance by Hardy. How many Ramanujan out there? How many Picassos are out there? How many Einsteins out there who are doing incredible things in their spaces, but we never know of them because they were not at that moment in history which was open to, Picasso was Picasso because he was at that moment in history, right? And so it's kind of interesting to me to think about that. And it's this imagined story which captures it. So I think that's a fun little nugget there.
So much of my education at ASU in media studies was about, the power of reception and interpretation, and that your story about, imagining this science fiction story and, the connections that it has to the actual story you read, and that, it really is such a great sum up of that really what we're doing with cultural texts when we talk about them in forums like this, and when we remember them, and when we,
Yeah.
levy them to inspire us, is we're actually transforming them and rereading them and putting new meanings onto them. And it can be a really profound thing, clearly.
It is.
Yeah. Okay, well, thank you for, I did not tell these two that I'd be asking them for a science fiction recommendation. I wouldn't normally do that, but I had faith that both of you'd come up with something great, and you did. So, and Phoebe, I was going to let you get away with saying The Dispossessed again if you needed to, so, because that's such a great example. But thank you both so much for your generosity with your time and insights, for being here with us today. I put in chat, but I will read out, like, you can learn more about Phoebe and her work at phoebe-wagner.com, and follow her on Twitter at Phoebes, PHEEBS_W. You can also learn more about Punya and his work at punyamishra.com, and follow him on Twitter at Punya Mishra. And finally, again, you can read Us in Flux stories and watch past events at csi.asu.edu/usinflux. And our Twitter handle is imaginationasu. And I should sum up by thanking everybody at the Center for Science and the Imagination for their support and collaboration in making this series and event possible. The 2022 cycle of Us in Flux is made possible by generous support from John S. Martinson. And we'll be back in August with a story that we're really excited about by Sui Davies Okungboa. And thank you to the two of you, and for everybody who's been here today for joining us.
Thank you, Joey, and thank you, Phoebe.
Yeah, thank you both.
All right, farewell.